I wasn't sure what to expect when my sister's son came to stay with us. Ethan had just turned 21, and my sister begged me to let him crash at our house for a few weeks while he sorted out his job situation. He's harmless, she had assured me. Just give him a chance. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, what's the worst that could happen? When Ethan showed up at our doorstep, I was surprised. He wasn't the lanky, awkward teenager I remembered. He'd grown into a man, broad shoulders, piercing blue eyes, and a confidence that seemed almost out of place. I felt a strange flutter in my stomach as I shook his hand. I brushed it off. The first few days were uneventful. Ethan was polite, helpful even, and spent most of his time in the guest room or out running errands. But then came that evening. The evening that changed everything. My husband, Greg, had gone out of town for a business trip. I'd spent the day cleaning the house, and by evening I was exhausted. As I stretched out on the couch, Ethan walked into the living room, carrying a tray with a cup of tea. "You look like you've had a long day," he said, setting the tray down in front of me. "You should let me help you relax." I laughed nervously. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" "I'm studying sports therapy," he explained, sitting down beside me. "I've learned a few massage techniques that could help." I hesitated. The idea of Ethan touching me felt wrong, but the ache in my shoulders was unbearable, and the thought of relief was tempting. "All right," I said finally, "but just my shoulders." Ethan smiled. "Of course." He moved behind the couch and placed his hands on my shoulders. His touch was firm yet gentle, and I couldn't help but let out a small sigh as the tension began to melt away. "Wow," I muttered. "You're really good at this." "Told you," he said with a chuckle. His hands moved lower, working out the knots in my upper back. I should have stopped him, but the sensation was too intoxicating. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to enjoy the moment. That's when things took an unexpected turn. "You're so tense," Ethan murmured, his voice low. "I think the stress is affecting more than just your back." I opened my eyes and turned to look at him. There was something in his gaze, a mix of concern and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You've been doing everything for everyone else," he said. "When was the last time someone took care of you?" His words hit me like a ton of bricks. He was right. I'd been so focused on being a good wife, a good sister, a good host, that I'd completely neglected myself. But before I could respond, Ethan's hands moved to my arms, his thumbs tracing slow circles along my biceps. "Ethan," I started, my heart racing. "Shh," he said, his voice soothing. "Just relax." I knew I should stop him. I knew this was crossing a line. But as his hands moved lower, brushing against my forearms, I felt a surge of electricity that I couldn't ignore. My breathing quickened and my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Was this really happening? Ethan leaned closer, his breath warm against my neck. "You deserve to feel good," he whispered. "This is wrong," I managed to say, though my voice lacked conviction. "Does it feel wrong?" he asked, his lips dangerously close to my ear. My body betrayed me, responding to his touch in ways I couldn't control. I wanted to pull away, but something held me there, an invisible force that made it impossible to move. Just then, the sound of my phone vibrating on the coffee table snapped me back to reality. I pulled away from Ethan. My face flushed. "I think that's enough," I said, grabbing my phone and standing up. "Thank you for the massage." Ethan didn't say anything. He just watched me, his eyes unreadable. As I walked out of the room, I could feel his gaze following me, and it sent a shiver down my spine. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed the events of the evening over and over again. I felt guilty, ashamed, and yet I couldn't deny the thrill I'd felt. What was wrong with me? The days that followed were tense. Ethan acted as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the memory of his touch. Every time we crossed paths, my heart raced, and I found myself avoiding him as much as possible. But avoidance only worked for so long. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Ethan walked in. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, keeping my eyes on the pile of clothes in front of me. "Yes, there is," he insisted, sitting down across from me. "I crossed a line and I'm sorry, but I can't stop thinking about you." His words caught me off guard. I looked up at him, unsure of what to say. "Ethan." "Don't," he interrupted. "I know it's complicated. I know it's wrong. But there's something here, isn't there?" I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things, but the truth was, he wasn't. There was something there, something neither of us could ignore. Before I could respond, Ethan reached out and took my hand in his. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said, "but I can't pretend I don't feel this way." The intensity in his eyes was overwhelming, and I felt my resolve crumbling. But before I could say or do anything, the sound of the front door opening broke the moment. Greg was home. The tension in the room was palpable, as Ethan quickly let go of my hand and stood up. "Good night," he said, his voice tight. And with that, he walked out of the room. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. His words, his touch, his gaze, they were all burned into my memory. I knew I had to make a decision, but I didn't know if I had the strength to do what was right. And so, the days turned into weeks, each one more agonizing than the last. The tension between Ethan and me grew with every passing moment, until finally, something had to give. One afternoon, while Greg was at work, I found Ethan in the kitchen. He was making a sandwich, completely unaware of my presence. I stood there for a moment, watching him, my mind racing with everything I wanted to say but couldn't. "Ethan," I said finally, my voice trembling. He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "Yes?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "We can't keep doing this. The looks, the tension, it has to stop." Ethan set down the knife he was holding and leaned against the counter. "I know," he said quietly, "but that doesn't make it any easier." "No, it doesn't," I admitted. "But we have to think about Greg, about my sister. This could destroy everything." "You're right," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But that doesn't change how I feel about you." "And it doesn't change how I feel about you," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we have to let this go." Ethan nodded, though I could see the pain in his eyes. "I understand," he said. "But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy." "No," I agreed. "It won't be." As I turned to leave the kitchen, Ethan called out to me. "For what it's worth, I'll never regret the way I feel about you." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I walked out of the kitchen, my heart heavy with the weight of what could never be. The weeks that followed were a blur. Ethan kept his distance, and I did my best to focus on my marriage. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of him, his touch, his words, his gaze. They haunted me. A constant reminder of the line I'd come dangerously close to crossing. Eventually, Ethan found a job and moved out. The house felt emptier without him, but it was for the best. Life went on, and Greg never suspected a thing. But every now and then, when I was alone, I'd find myself thinking about Ethan and wondering what might have been. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some are just lessons, painful, bittersweet lessons that remind us of the choices we make and the paths we take. And though I'll always wonder what could have been, I know I made the right choice. For myself, for my husband, and for the family I hold dear.